The smell is the first thing that hits you in the morning. Not coffee, not bacon, but the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic cleaner fighting a losing battle against the faint, cloying sweetness of decay. It's the smell of my life, the air I have breathed for the last 5 years. It clung to my clothes, my skin, my hair. Some days I felt like it had seeped into my very soul. This particular Tuesday began with a sound that ripped through the quiet dawn, a ragged, wet cough from my father's room followed by a thud. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I was out of bed before my eyes were fully open, my bare feet cold against the worn wooden floorboards of our old house in Havenwood, Ohio. The house my father Arthur had built with his own hands. The house he no longer recognized. I found him on the floor, tangled in his sheets, his frail body trembling. His eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were clouded with confusion and fear. He'd tried to get out of bed on his own again. This was the 3rd time this month. The local doctor, a kind but weary man named Peterson, had been adamant after the last fall. He had told us my father needed a fully automated hospital-grade medical bed with pressure sensors and restraints. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a necessity. My mother Eleanor was already there, her hand pressed to her mouth in a gesture of perfectly crafted horror. She looked at me, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. She told me she had heard him stir, that she was just about to check on him. Her voice was a fragile whisper, the one she used when she wanted to convey the immense burden she was carrying. Together we lifted him. He was shockingly light, a collection of brittle bones and paper-thin skin. The strength had long since been leached from his body by the relentless thief that was Alzheimer's. As I settled him back into his bed, arranging the pillows and checking for any new bruises, my mother began her familiar litany. She spoke of how she didn't know what she would do without me, how I was their rock, their salvation. She called me her saint, her personal martyr. The words, once a source of weary pride, now felt like stones piling up on my chest, each one making it harder to breathe. I was no saint. I was a 35-year-old man whose world had shrunk to the 4 walls of this suffocating house. 2 weeks. It had been 2 weeks since Dr. Peterson had written the prescription for the bed. 2 weeks since my sister Clara had wired the money. Clara, the successful one, the corporate lawyer in San Francisco with a corner office and a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. She couldn't be here to deal with the daily unpleasantness, the bedpans, the sponge baths, the vacant stairs, but she could assuage her guilt with wire transfers. $6,000 had appeared in the joint account my mother managed, an amount Clara had assured us was more than enough to cover the top-of-the-line model and its installation. Yet my father was still sleeping in a bed that was actively trying to harm him. Later that morning, after I had spoon-fed my father his oatmeal and administered his morning cocktail of medications, I found my mother in the kitchen humming softly as she polished the silver. It was something she did when she was avoiding a difficult topic. The silver was already immaculate, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I leaned against the doorframe, my muscles aching from the morning's exertion, and I asked her about the bed. I kept my voice even, careful not to betray the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. She didn't look at me. She just kept rubbing a soft cloth over the handle of a gravy ladle. She explained in that patient tone one might use with a difficult child that there had been a complication. The first company she called, she said, had terrible reviews and she wouldn't trust them with Arthur's safety. The second one, a more reputable supplier from Cleveland, was on backorder for the specific model Dr. Peterson recommended. She told me she had spent hours on the phone fighting for us, trying to get the best possible care for my father. She assured me it would only be another week. I wanted to believe her. For 5 years I had believed her. I had given up my apartment in Chicago, my job as a graphic designer, my friends, my future, all of it to come home. When my father's diagnosis had become severe, it was the unspoken assumption that I, the unmarried son, would be the one to return. Clara had her career. My mother had her fragile nerves, and I had a sense of duty that felt more like a disease. My mother had nurtured that duty, praising my sacrifice to anyone who would listen. The whole town of Havenwood saw me as a paragon of filial piety. That Liam, they'd say at the grocery store, what a good boy. His mother is so blessed. But a week passed and then another. My father had another small fall this time, just a slip, but it left a dark purple bloom on his hip. The excuse from my mother changed. Now she claimed there was an issue with the insurance paperwork. They were refusing to cover a portion of the cost and she was appealing the decision. She told me she didn't want to worry Clara by asking for more money. She said we would manage, that we always did. She squeezed my arm, her eyes shining with manufactured resilience, and told me that our family was strong. The performance was beginning to wear thin. I started noticing things I had previously ignored: small cracks in the facade of our noble struggle. I saw the mail-order catalogs for expensive clothing hidden under the sofa cushions. I noticed my mother's weekly trips to the hairdresser had become twice weekly. She always had a reason, of course. She would say she needed to look presentable for the church committee, that maintaining appearances was important for the family's morale. The breaking point didn't come with a crash, but with a quiet clinical phone call. I was in the small office I had set up in the back of the house, trying to squeeze in a few hours of freelance design work to maintain a sliver of my old life when the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. A polite professional woman's voice on the other end introduced herself as being from the bank's fraud prevention department. She informed me that she was calling about the joint account ending in 4,325. My mother's account. The account Clara sent money to. She stated that there had been some unusual activity and that the account was currently overdrawn by nearly $2,000. The world tilted on its axis. Overdrawn, that was impossible. Clara's $6,000 had been deposited less than a month ago. My own freelance payments, though modest, also went into that account to help with groceries and utilities. I felt a cold dread snake its way up my spine. The representative continued, her voice a calm, detached drone. She asked if I could verify a series of recent transactions. A charge for $300 at a boutique called Eleanor's Closet in a neighboring city. I felt a jolt recognizing the name from a shopping bag I had seen my mother try to hide a few weeks ago. Multiple charges at a high-end spa totaling over $500. My mother had told me she was attending a grief support workshop. A recurring monthly charge of $800 listed as a payment to a luxury car dealership. My mother drove a 10-year-old sedan. The list went on. Restaurants I'd never heard of. Online stores I'd never seen. The polite woman on the phone waited for my confirmation, and all I could manage was a choked whisper telling her it must be a mistake, that I would have to look into it. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my small office, the hum of my computer the only sound. The smell of antiseptic seemed stronger than ever, suffocating me. The image of my sainted mother, the grieving wife, the pillar of our broken family, shattered into a million pieces. In her place was a stranger, a thief who polished silver while her husband lay in a dangerous bed and her son withered away. I walked back into the kitchen, the flimsy bank statements I had printed trembling in my hand. My mother was there, arranging flowers in a vase. She smiled when she saw me, a bright, empty smile. She commented on what a beautiful day it was. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid the papers on the kitchen table right next to her perfectly arranged bouquet. I asked her to explain. Her reaction was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. First came the denial, a flurry of confusion where she claimed the bank must have made a terrible error. She said she would call them immediately and give them a piece of her mind for frightening me like this. But when I didn't back down, when my eyes remained fixed on hers, her strategy shifted. The tears came big and theatrical. Her lower lip trembled. She sank into a chair, her hand clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. She accused me of not trusting her, of being cruel. After all she had been through, how could I think such things? She sobbed that the stress of caring for Arthur was unbearable, that maybe she had gotten confused about the finances, that her mind wasn't what it used to be. She was the victim and I was her tormentor. It was a performance she had honed over decades, a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. And for my entire life it had worked. But not today. Today, the polite voice from the fraud department had severed the strings she used to control me. I looked at this crying woman, this stranger, and I felt nothing. The love, the sense of duty, the guilt, it had all evaporated, replaced by an icy, terrifying clarity. I wasn't her saint. I was her enabler. My sacrifice wasn't holding our family together, it was funding her secret life. My presence here wasn't a blessing, it was a convenience. It allowed her to play the role of the devoted wife while I did the actual work, all while she siphoned away the money meant for my father's care and my sister's peace of mind. I stood there watching her sob, and I knew this was only the beginning. The truth was a poison, and it had just begun to seep into the foundations of our home. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the saint of Havenwood was dead. And in his place, something new, something cold and patient was beginning to take root. My revenge wouldn't be loud or angry. It would be quiet, methodical, and absolute. I would dismantle the life she had built on my back, piece by painful piece. The silence that followed my mother's theatrical breakdown was heavier than any argument. Her sobs tapered off into hiccuping breaths, and she dabbed at her dry eyes with the cuff of her sleeve. She had played her final card, and for the first time in my life I had not folded. I left the bank statements on the table, a stark black and white testament to her lies, and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't have the energy for a second round. The initial shock had receded, leaving behind a profound, hollow emptiness. It was the feeling of discovering that the very foundation of your house is riddled with termites, that the support beams you've been leaning on your whole life are nothing but dust. I retreated to my small office, the only space in the house that felt truly mine. It was a converted porch, cramped and drafty, but it held my computer, my books, and the ghost of the man I used to be. I sank into my worn office chair and stared at the framed photo on my desk. It was from 15 years ago, a family trip to Lake Erie. My father, robust and laughing, had his arm around a teenage me. My mother stood beside him, her smile bright and genuine. Clara was off to the side, rolling her eyes in that way only a 16-year-old sister can. We looked happy. We looked real. My mind, seeking an anchor in the storm, drifted back, sifting through memories that were now tainted by suspicion. I remembered my 10th birthday. More than anything, I had wanted a new Schwinn bicycle, a sleek, 10-speed model I had seen in the window of the downtown hardware store. I had begged for weeks. On the morning of my birthday, my mother sat me down, her eyes welling with tears. She explained, her voice thick with sorrow, that my grandfather had taken a bad fall and that they had to send him money for his medical bills. She told me how much it broke her heart not to be able to afford the bicycle, but that family had to come first. She said she knew I had a big heart and that I would understand. I did understand. I felt a hot flush of shame for my own selfishness. I remember hugging her, telling her it was okay that I didn't need the bike. I spent the rest of the day feeling profoundly noble, a little boy who had made a grown-up sacrifice. My father gave me a set of encyclopedias instead. That year, my mother bought herself a brand new set of expensive pearl jewelry. When I asked about it, she simply said it was a gift from my father for their anniversary, a way to cheer her up after the stress of her own father's health scare. I believed her. I always believed her. How many other sacrifices, both mine and my father's, had been built on similar lies? How much of my perceived nobility was just expertly orchestrated manipulation? The memory of the family meeting that sealed my fate 5 years ago came next, replaying in my mind with sickening clarity. We were all gathered around the same kitchen table where the bank statements now lay. Dr. Peterson had just delivered the news that my father's Alzheimer's was progressing rapidly, that he would soon need full-time care. Clara, home for a rare weekend visit, immediately started talking about high-end care facilities and hiring private nurses. My mother had let her speak, nodding sadly. Then she had turned her gaze to me. She didn't need to say a word. She just looked at me with those bottomless, pleading eyes. She spoke about how Arthur would hate a sterile nursing home, how he would be terrified among strangers. She talked about the sanctity of family, of how a son's love was a medicine no doctor could prescribe. She mentioned in passing how Clara's career was so important and demanding, and how she herself was just too frail, her heart too weak to handle the physical strain alone. She had painted a picture so vivid, so emotionally compelling, that my return home seemed not like a choice but like a sacred, inevitable calling. Clara, relieved, had quickly agreed to cover all the finances. I, the dutiful son, had agreed to cover everything else. I had walked into my cage with the cell door wide open, believing it was a sanctuary. A new resolve hardened within me, cold and sharp. I needed more than just bank statements. I needed irrefutable proof, a case so airtight that even her tears couldn't erode it. My campaign began with a simple, transgressive act. I started getting the mail before she could. For years, she had made it a ritual, retrieving the mail from the box at the end of the driveway as soon as the postman's truck rumbled away. Now I watched from my office window, and the moment the truck turned the corner, I would head out, my heart pounding with the thrill of a spy. For 3 days, it was nothing but junk mail and bills for utilities. But on the 4th day, I found it. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the logo of a prestigious car brand, Lexus. It was addressed to my mother. My hands trembled as I carefully steamed it open over the kettle in the kitchen, a trick I'd seen in old movies. Inside was a lease agreement. My mother, Eleanor Vance, was leasing a brand new Lexus RX 350, a luxury SUV with a monthly payment of $795. The address for the lessee was ours. The mailing address for the bill, however, was a P.O. box in a neighboring town. She had been hiding it. A car. A car that was nowhere in our garage, which housed only her aging Ford Taurus and my father's old dust-covered pickup. The pieces clicked together with a horrifying snap. The recurring charge from the luxury car dealership. her frequent trips to visit sick friends or attend workshops out of town. The lies were more intricate, more audacious than I could have ever imagined. She wasn't just spending the money, she was living an entirely separate life with it. That evening, I confronted her again. This time, I was armed. There were no tears, no dramatic performances. I walked into the living room where she was watching television and placed the lease agreement on the coffee table in front of her. I asked her to tell me about her new car. Her face, illuminated by the flickering television screen, went through a series of rapid transformations: shock, then fear, then a flicker of pure, unadulterated rage. She saw the opened envelope and knew she was caught. But a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. She didn't break down. Instead, she composed herself, a chilling calm settling over her features. She told me I had a suspicious, untrusting heart. She then spun a story so elaborate, so steeped in feigned compassion, that a younger version of me would have been floored by her generosity. She claimed the car wasn't for her. It was for Margaret, a dear friend from church who had been widowed last year. Margaret's husband, she explained, had left her with crippling debt and her old car had broken down. The poor woman was too proud to accept charity, so my mother had devised a plan. She had leased the car in her own name and was letting Margaret use it, telling her it was an old family vehicle they no longer needed. The P.O. box was to keep the bills a secret to protect Margaret's dignity. She looked me straight in the eye, her voice unwavering, and asked me how I could think something so ugly about my own mother, who was only trying to do a good Christian deed in secret. She was turning her deception into a form of martyrdom, another act of sainthood. It was a brilliant lie. It was also easily verifiable. While she slept that night, I took her phone. My fingers felt like ice as I scrolled through her contacts. I found Margaret's number. I knew her vaguely from church, a quiet, gentle woman who always wore shades of gray. I also found something else, a saved GPS location simply labeled the apartment. It was in the same town where she had her P.O. box. The next morning, I knew I couldn't do this alone anymore. I was too close, too enmeshed in the web. I needed an outside perspective. I needed a lawyer. I needed my sister. I called Clara. It was early on the West Coast, and she answered with a groggy, irritated voice. I could hear the clatter of a coffee shop in the background. She was already at work. I told her I needed to talk, that it was urgent. She sighed a sound of pure impatience and told me she had a deposition in an hour. I found myself telling her everything, the words spilling out in a torrent. I told her about the bank account, the missing $6,000, the non-existent medical bed, the spa treatments, the Lexus. I told her about the lies, one piling on top of the other. At first, her response was predictably dismissive. She told me Mom was probably just overwhelmed and confused. She suggested that I was overreacting, that living in that house was finally getting to me. She had always been insulated from the truth, and the truth was an unwelcome intrusion. But I was persistent. I was cold. I was factual. I am a lawyer, she had once told me. I deal in evidence, so I gave her evidence. I emailed her a scanned copy of the bank statement and the lease agreement while we were on the phone. I heard her sharp intake of breath as she opened the files. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a full minute. The clatter of the coffee shop faded as she presumably moved somewhere private. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The irritation was gone, replaced by a steely edge I hadn't heard since she cross-examined my father about his finances during their divorce proceedings. She asked me to repeat the address of the P.O. box. She asked me to forward her the bank's contact information. She didn't offer sympathy or comfort. She offered a plan. She told me not to confront our mother again. She told me not to let on that I had spoken to her. She said she would do some digging on her end and would call me back in 24 hours. After we hung up, I stood by my office window looking out at the manicured front lawn. My mother was outside tending to her rose bushes, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat. She snipped away dead blooms with meticulous care, the picture of serene domesticity. To any passerby, she was a grieving wife and a devoted mother finding solace in her garden. But I saw the truth. I saw the rot beneath the blossoms. The battle was no longer just mine. Clara was engaged now. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and I had a feeling the game was about to become far more brutal than I had ever anticipated. The 24 hours I spent waiting for Clara's call were the longest of my life. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent actor in a play where only I knew the script was a lie. I moved through the familiar motions, checking on my father, preparing meals, cleaning, but my mind was 1,000 miles away, replaying every conversation, every manufactured smile, every hollow word of praise my mother had ever given me. The pain was a physical thing, a constant dull pressure behind my sternum. Each moment I had to pretend, each time I had to answer one of her cheerful questions about my father's appetite or the weather. The pressure intensified. The peak of this silent agony arrived on Wednesday afternoon. I was helping my father with his physical therapy, a slow, painstaking walk down the hallway, my arm firmly around his skeletal frame. His feet shuffled, his breath came in shallow rasps. My mother was watching from the kitchen doorway, a mug of tea in her hands. She offered a stream of saccharine encouragement, telling him how strong he was, how proud she was of both of us. Her voice was like nails on a chalkboard to my raw nerves. Suddenly, my father's legs buckled. There was no warning. One moment he was shuffling forward, the next he was dead weight. I tried to hold him, my muscles screaming in protest, but his descent was too quick. We went down together in a heap, his head narrowly missing the sharp corner of a side table. A cry of pure terror escaped his lips, a sound more lucid and heartbreaking than any I had heard from him in months. My mother shrieked. She dropped her mug, the ceramic shattering on the linoleum, and rushed over. But she didn't help. She just stood there, wringing her hands, her face a mask of performative panic. She kept repeating my name, telling me to do something, as if I weren't already straining to cradle my father's head and check him for injuries. In that moment, lying on the floor with my frail, terrified father in my arms, I felt a surge of hatred so pure and so potent it almost choked me. This was her fault. This terror, this pain, this undignified collapse in a drafty hallway, it was the direct result of her greed. The $6,000 that should have provided a safe, secure medical bed had been transformed into spa treatments and lease payments for a car he would never see. My father was suffering right here, right now because of her. The pain inside me was no longer a dull pressure. It was a white-hot nova of rage. I wanted to scream at her, to expose her right there over my father's trembling body. But I didn't. I held it in, letting it burn, letting it fuel the cold resolve that was now the only thing holding me together. Clara called an hour later while I was settling my father back into bed, his breathing still ragged. I took the call in my office and closed the door. Her voice was stripped of all emotion, a lawyer's voice. She told me she had spent the last day making inquiries. She informed me that she had called Margaret, the supposed recipient of the charity Lexus. The call had been brief. Clara had simply asked her how she was enjoying the new car Eleanor had so generously arranged for her. There was a long, confused silence on the other end before Margaret had finally replied that she didn't know what Clara was talking about. She was still driving her 20-year-old Honda Civic. Clara had also run a background check. She'd found the P.O. box, and through it she'd found the address of the apartment. It was a unit in a modern, upscale condominium complex called The Willows, located in the city of Northgate, about an hour's drive away. The lease was solely in our mother's name. This wasn't a hideout. It was a second home. A second life. She then laid out the first step of our plan. It was simple, elegant, and brutal. She explained that since her wire transfers were made to a joint account under the pretense of covering our father's medical expenses, and since she held a durable power of attorney for his financial affairs, she had a legal basis to act. She had already contacted Lexus Financial Services. She had informed them that the vehicle was leased under fraudulent pretenses, using funds designated for an incapacitated person's care. She had told them the family considered the vehicle to be misappropriated, and that we would not be making any further payments. The finance company, she said, was not pleased. They had informed her that they would be dispatching a repossession agent within the next 48 hours. She then gave me a final chilling instruction. She told me to do nothing but watch. For the next day and a half, I was a coiled spring. The rage had subsided, replaced by a tense, humming anticipation. The pain was still there, a constant echo of my father's fall, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was now a reminder of why this was necessary. I watched my mother go about her routine, oblivious. She hummed in the kitchen. She complained about the price of groceries. She was a woman without a care in the world, living comfortably inside her fortress of lies. But she didn't know that an army was at her gate. The army arrived on Friday morning in the form of a single hulking tow truck. It was a grimy, menacing beast of a machine, and it pulled up to the curb right in front of our house with a hiss of air brakes that seemed to shake the very windows. I was in the living room pretending to read, but I had been watching the street for hours. My mother was in the front yard watering her prize-winning roses. She looked up, her face a mask of mild annoyance at the disruption. A burly man in a grease-stained jumpsuit got out of the truck and consulted a clipboard. He walked up our driveway, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. I watched the entire exchange through the bay window. I saw him show her the paperwork. I saw her smile, a patronizing, dismissive smile, and I could practically hear her telling him he must have the wrong house. Then I saw the man point directly at her Ford Taurus in the driveway. He said something, and the smile vanished from her face. It was replaced by confusion. She shook her head, gesturing to the old car. The man was patient. He spoke again, and then I saw him point down the street. And there it was. Parked 2 houses down, gleaming in the morning sun, was the pearlescent white Lexus RX 350. She must have parked it there before coming home, a clever little tactic to maintain the illusion. The color drained from my mother's face. The confusion morphed into pure, unadulterated panic. She started talking rapidly, her hands flying. The man simply shook his head and walked back to his truck. He began backing it up the hydraulic lift, lowering with a menacing groan. This was the moment. My mother ran, not with the feigned frailty she so often displayed, but with the desperate energy of a true believer whose God was being desecrated. She stood in front of the Lexus, spreading her arms as if to protect it. She was shouting now, her voice shrill and ugly, attracting the attention of our neighbors. Mrs. Gable from next door peered out from behind her curtains. Old Mr. Henderson paused his lawn mowing to stare. The tow truck driver was unfazed. He got out of his truck, said something into a walkie-talkie, and then calmly began hooking the Lexus to the lift. My mother screamed at him, threatening to call the police, threatening to sue him, his company, and everyone he had ever known. He ignored her completely. Watching from the window, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. It was a slow, rising tide of satisfaction, so intense it was almost euphoric. The knot of pain in my chest didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip, pushed aside by this new powerful emotion. Every one of her shrieks was a balm to my wounded soul. Every mortified glance from our neighbors was a small measure of justice. This was not the sainted grieving widow of Havenwood. This was a hysterical woman trying to stop her secret luxury car from being repossessed in broad daylight. The mask was being ripped away, and the ugliness beneath was on public display. They dragged the car away, its tires screeching in protest against the asphalt. My mother stood on the curb, her arms hanging limply at her sides, watching it go. Her shoulders were slumped. She was utterly defeated. When she came back inside, she was a different person. The soft, gentle mother was gone. In her place was a creature of pure venom. Her eyes were hard, her face contorted with fury. She stormed into the living room and pointed a trembling finger at me. She didn't ask. She accused. She snarled that this was my doing, that I had always been a jealous, spiteful child. She said I couldn't stand to see her have one nice thing for herself. Then she brought up Clara, spitting her name like a curse. She screamed that my sister, with all her money and her fancy life, had turned me against my own mother. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I simply looked up from my book and met her gaze. I told her, my voice unnervingly calm, that I had no idea what she was talking about. I said that perhaps the friend she had so generously lent the car to had stopped making payments. The color drained from her face again as she realized I knew about her lie. The power dynamic in the house had irrevocably shifted. The pain of my father's fall was still a fresh wound, but for the first time I felt like I had applied a clean antiseptic bandage to it. One lie had been cauterized. One secret had been dragged into the light. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Clara. It contained only 2 things: the address for the Willows condominium and a single question. Ready for step 2. The repossession of the Lexus was a public spectacle, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of our family's life. Step 2 was designed to be the opposite: quiet, precise, and devastatingly private. It was an excavation, a deliberate and methodical digging through the ruins of my mother's secret life, and I was to be the lead archaeologist. The atmosphere in the house turned glacial. My mother and I moved around each other like hostile celestial bodies, our orbits carefully calibrated to avoid collision. She no longer spoke to me unless absolutely necessary, and her grief-stricken, saintly persona was replaced by a sullen, simmering resentment. She saw me not as her son, but as her jailer. The satisfaction I had felt watching the tow truck haul away her prized possession had been potent, but it was fleeting. It was the thrill of a single battle. Now it was time to win the war. Clara's instructions were clear. She had discovered that the lease on the apartment at the Willows was up for renewal in 2 weeks. Our mother would have to either sign a new year-long lease or vacate the premises. Clara had also learned through means she refused to disclose, but which I assumed involved her firm's private investigators, that our mother had been using the apartment as her primary mailing address for a host of personal credit cards. bank accounts that we had no knowledge of. The plan was elegantly simple. I was to go to the apartment gain entry and gather every piece of financial documentation I could find. We needed a complete picture of the scale of her deceit before we made our final move. The thought of breaking into her private sanctuary filled me with a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about uncovering the truth of the woman who had raised me. It felt like a profound violation, but a necessary one. The Liam of a month ago would have been paralyzed by guilt at the mere thought of such a thing. The new Liam, however, was fueled by the memory of his father's terrified cry as he fell. The opportunity came 3 days later. My mother announced, her voice clipped and cold, that she would be gone for most of the day. She claimed she was attending an all-day prayer retreat at a monastery 2 hours away. It was an obvious lie, but a useful one. I knew she was likely going to Northgate to lick her wounds and perhaps try to salvage her situation. While she was gone, I arranged for a trusted caregiver from a local agency, a woman named Sarah, whom my father liked to stay with him for the afternoon. I told my mother Sarah was coming to give me a few hours off to run errands and clear my head. My mother had just grunted in response, indifferent to my supposed emotional state now that I was no longer a useful pawn. The drive to Northgate was surreal. As the familiar, sleepy landscape of Havenwood gave way to the bustling suburbs, and then the city itself, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't Liam the caregiver. I was Liam the operative on a mission of my own design. The Willows was exactly what I'd expected, a sterile, modern complex of beige buildings surrounded by meticulously landscaped flower beds. It was the kind of place that screamed anonymous, transient affluence. Using the spare key my mother kept on her car keychain, a key whose purpose I now understood, I let myself into her building. Her apartment number 3B was on the top floor. Standing outside her door, I felt a tremor of hesitation. This was the final boundary. Crossing it meant there was no going back. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of stale air freshener, and inserted the key. The lock clicked open with a soft, final sound. The apartment was like stepping into the life of a complete stranger. It was a mirror image of our cluttered, lived-in home in Havenwood, but everything here was new, sleek, and impersonal. A gray sectional sofa sat on a white shag rug. A large, flat-screen television was mounted on the wall. The kitchen had gleaming stainless steel appliances that looked like they had barely been used. It was the apartment of a single, successful woman, not a grieving 60-year-old grandmother. But I wasn't there for the decor. I was there for the paper trail. I started in the small office nook in the corner of the living room. It was exactly as Clara had predicted. In a neat little filing cabinet, I found it all. Statements for 3 different high-limit credit cards, all in her name. A checkbook for a private bank account at a bank we had never used, with a balance that made my stomach clench. And then I found the source of the funds. Tucked away in a folder labeled Investments were statements from a brokerage account. It had been opened 30 years ago, an inheritance from my maternal grandfather that my father and I were told had been lost in a bad stock market crash in the late 92nd. It hadn't been lost. It had been hidden. For decades, it had been sitting there, growing, compounding a secret dragon's hoard of wealth that she had told us was nothing but ash. The sheer scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't just about Clara's money. This was a lifetime of lies. Our struggles, the vacations we never took, the college fund for me that never quite materialized, my father's constant worry about money, it had all been a charade. She had watched us struggle, had actively participated in that struggle, all while sitting on a fortune. I worked quickly, methodically. I used a scanning app on my phone, turning each damning page into a clear, crisp PDF. Statements, receipts, the lease agreement for the apartment itself. Each document was another nail in the coffin of the woman I thought was my mother. The pain I felt was no longer the hot rage from the day of my father's fall, nor the cold satisfaction of the repossession. This was a deeper, more profound ache, the sorrow of mourning someone who was still alive. The mother I loved had never really existed. She was a fiction she had created, and I had been her most devoted reader. As I was finishing, my eyes landed on a small lacquered box on the nightstand in the bedroom. Driven by an impulse I didn't understand, I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not jewelry but a small collection of photographs. My heart stopped. They were pictures of her with another man. A man I didn't recognize, with silver hair and an easy smile. They were on a boat laughing. They were at a restaurant holding hands across the table. They were standing in front of a Christmas tree in what was clearly this very apartment. The dates on the back of the photos spanned the last 3 years. This was the final piece, the keystone that locked the entire horrifying structure of her lies into place. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about a secret life. She had a secret partner. While my father faded away in a haze of dementia, she was building a new life with someone else. While I sacrificed my future to care for him, she was living out a romantic fantasy funded by decades of deceit. I scanned the photos, my hands shaking with a mixture of revulsion and a strange, liberating clarity. I had everything I needed. I left the apartment exactly as I had found it, the box of photos back on the nightstand, a silent time bomb waiting to explode. On the drive home, I felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the truth. There was no more pain, no more rage, only a crystalline sense of purpose. This was no longer just about revenge for a stolen car or misused funds. This was about justice for a stolen life, my father's and my own. I emailed the encrypted folder of scanned documents to Clara, with a simple subject line, "The full picture." When I got home, my mother was already there, sitting in the living room. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She asked me where I had been. I looked her straight in the eye, my face a perfect mask of calm. I told her I had just been driving around, clearing my head as I'd planned. I said it was a beautiful day for a drive. For the first time, I was the one lying, and it felt effortless. It felt like power. She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for a crack, for a tell. She found nothing. She was an expert at deception, but she was a novice at being deceived. She had underestimated me. She had assumed the saint she created was incapable of sin. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The storm broke on a Saturday. Clara flew in from San Francisco on the red-eye, arriving on our doorstep at 7 in the morning. I had been expecting her, but my mother had not. The sight of her eldest daughter dressed in a sharply tailored black pantsuit and carrying a leather briefcase standing on the porch like an avenging angel seemed to shrink my mother where she stood. The color drained from her face. She knew this was not a social call. Clara's demeanor was arctic. She offered no hug, no warm greeting. She walked past our mother as if she were a piece of furniture and placed her briefcase on the dining room table with a definitive thud. She turned to me, her eyes meeting mine for a brief, significant moment. It was a look of grim solidarity. Then she turned her full attention to our mother. She stated in a voice devoid of any warmth that she was there to discuss the gross mismanagement of our father's finances. She informed our mother that she had scheduled a meeting with Arthur's estate lawyer for Monday morning and that she expected her to be present. My mother for a moment tried to rally. She attempted to fall back on her old tactics, her voice quavering as she accused Clara of being cold and heartless, of storming in and making baseless accusations. She began to cry, speaking of her unending stress and her thankless sacrifices. It was a familiar, well-rehearsed performance, but its power had been neutralized. We were no longer a captive audience. Clara was unmoved. She waited patiently for the theatrical tears to subside, her expression unchanging. Then she opened her briefcase. The first thing she placed on the polished wood of the table was a thick, spiral-bound report. She told our mother that it was a complete forensic audit of the joint account, detailing every dollar she had wired and tracing exactly where it had gone. She pointed to a highlighted section and calmly read aloud the totals for spa treatments, designer clothing, and fine dining. My mother fell silent, her face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. She stared at the report as if it were a venomous snake. Next, Clara produced a copy of the Lexus lease agreement and the subsequent repossession notice. She slid it across the table. She said that she found it interesting that our mother's charitable act for her friend Margaret had resulted in a hit to their family's credit score. My mother began to tremble, a fine, barely perceptible tremor that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did nothing to still the shaking. Then came the final, most devastating blow. Clara laid out a series of documents, fanning them out like a winning hand in a high-stakes card game. A copy of the lease for apartment number 3B at the Willows. A stack of credit card statements mailed to a secret P.O. box. The brokerage account statements showing a 6-figure balance that directly contradicted the narrative of poverty she had maintained for 3 decades. I watched my mother's face as she absorbed the evidence of her secret life laid bare on the family table. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The foundation of denial crumbled first, followed by the walls of indignant rage. All that was left was the raw, exposed structure of her guilt. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The shock was so profound it had stolen her voice. She was utterly, completely defeated. The matriarch, the master manipulator, the household saint was gone. In her place was just a small, frightened woman staring at the wreckage of her own creation. And then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. I was the one who answered it. Standing on the porch was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a pleasant, slightly worried smile. He was holding a bouquet of expensive-looking lilies. I recognized him instantly from the photographs in the lacquered box. He looked at me, his smile faltering slightly in confusion. He asked if Eleanor was home, saying that she hadn't been answering her phone. I felt a surge of ice-cold power. I stepped aside and opened the door wider, inviting him in. I told him she was in the dining room having a family meeting. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the hallway. As he walked into the dining room, his gaze fell upon the scene, my mother pale and trembling, Clara standing like a sentinel behind the table, and the damning array of documents spread across its surface. His cheerful demeanor evaporated. He looked at my mother, then at Clara, then at me. Confusion warred with dawning horror on his face. He asked what was going on. It was Clara who answered. She didn't raise her voice. She simply introduced herself. She told him that she was Eleanor's daughter and Arthur Vance's lawyer. She then asked him in a tone of polite professional inquiry to state his name and his relationship to her mother. The man, his name was Robert, I would later learn, looked at my mother, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. But my mother couldn't help him. She couldn't even look at him. She was staring at her own hands, which were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Robert stammered. He said he was a friend, a close friend. Clara's smile was thin and razor-sharp. She picked up one of the photographs I had scanned, the one of him and my mother on the boat, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. She held it up for him to see. She asked him if this was what he considered a friendly gesture. She then gestured to the apartment lease. She asked him if he enjoyed the apartment that had been paid for with money meant to care for her dying father. Robert was not a monster. I could see that now. He was just a man, an ordinary weak man who had been caught in the gravitational pull of my mother's lies. The blood drained from his face as the reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He looked at my mother, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and disgust. He whispered her name, a question and an accusation in one. He said she had told him her husband had died years ago. She had told him she was a lonely widow. That was it. That was the final crumbling stone. My mother let out a sound, a ragged, guttural sob that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of her. It was not a cry for sympathy. It was the howl of a trapped animal, the sound of a universe imploding. Robert didn't stay. He looked at my mother's collapsed form, then at Clara's implacable face, and then at me. He saw no allies here, no escape. He simply placed the bouquet of lilies on a nearby table, the funereal flowers, a sickeningly appropriate gesture, and walked out the front door without another word. We heard his car start, and then the sound of tires squealing as he sped away, leaving my mother alone in the ruins. She sat at the table for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just weeping these silent, shuddering tears. The shock had given way to a despair so profound it seemed to have hollowed her out from the inside. She was no longer a villain or a manipulator. She was pathetic. All the years of carefully constructed lies, all the intricate deceptions had been unraveled in the space of 15 minutes. Her secret life was gone. Her secret lover was gone. And the respect and love of her children were gone. She had nothing left. I looked at her, this broken woman, and I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a final satisfying release. But I didn't. The fire of my rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only cold gray ash. There was no joy in this victory. There was only a vast echoing emptiness. The revenge was complete. The traitors had been silenced. And all I felt was the profound, soul-crushing weight of it all. Revolutions are loud, but the aftermath is often quiet. The days following that cataclysmic Saturday were cloaked in a heavy, oppressive silence. My mother confined herself to her bedroom, emerging only late at night for a glass of water, a wraith haunting the hallways of the home she had so thoroughly corrupted. The house, which had once been a stage for her elaborate performances, now felt like a tomb. Clara stayed for another week, a whirlwind of legal efficiency. She and I operated with a quiet, unspoken understanding. There was no celebration, no gloating over our victory. There was only the grim, necessary work of sorting through the wreckage. Clara met with the lawyer, invoked her power of attorney, and methodically took control of every single asset. The secret brokerage account was frozen. The lease on the apartment was terminated. Notice was given to my mother that the house in Havenwood, which was solely in my father's name, was to be sold to cover the costs of his ongoing and future care. Our mother was to be left with a small, court-mandated spousal allowance enough to live on, but a pittance compared to the life she had been secretly leading. She was being erased financially and legally from the empire she had built on lies. Clara was not just dismantling the deception, she was salting the earth so that nothing like it could ever grow again. During that week, I finally had a real conversation with my sister. We sat on the back porch one evening watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, the first moment of peace we'd shared in years. She told me she was sorry. She said it with a lawyer's precision, as if it were a fact she was entering into evidence. She was sorry for not seeing it, for being so willing to buy the narrative of the sainted mother and the martyred son, because it was convenient. It had allowed her to keep her distance, to assuage her guilt with money instead of time. She admitted that her monthly wire transfers felt less like support and more like a subscription fee to a service that absolved her of her filial duties. I found myself confessing my own complicity. I told her how I had embraced the role of the saint, how a part of me had fed on the town's praise and my mother's adulation. My sacrifice, which I had believed to be pure, was tainted with a subtle form of pride. I had become so invested in the nobility of my suffering that I refused to see the signs that it was being exploited. We had both been enablers in our own ways. She had enabled our mother's greed with her money and distance. I had enabled it with my presence and my willful blindness. The most difficult conversation, however, was with my mother. On her last day, Clara insisted we speak to her together. We found her sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at a wall surrounded by packed boxes. She looked smaller, older, and utterly defeated. There were no more tears, no more hysterics. All that was left was a hollowed-out core of truth. She spoke in a monotone, her voice raspy from disuse. She told us about the inheritance from her father. She said that when she received it, she saw it not as a family asset, but as her escape hatch. She confessed that she had grown to resent my father long before he got sick, resented his simple dreams, his contentment with their small-town life, and the way he'd adored her with a devotion she felt she could never match, and secretly disdained. The money was her ticket to a life she felt she deserved, a life she had only ever seen in magazines. She admitted that when my father got sick, she saw not a tragedy but an opportunity. His illness became the perfect cover story. My return home was the final piece of the puzzle. My willing sacrifice provided her with the ultimate alibi, a full-time, unpaid caregiver who made her look like a suffering, devoted wife to the outside world, freeing her to spend her time and money elsewhere. She never intended for it to go so far, she claimed, but the lies took on a life of their own. Robert, the man with the lilies, was just another part of the fantasy, a man who saw her not as a tired caregiver but as the sophisticated, independent woman she played in Northgate. Listening to her, I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a profound, bottomless pity. Her entire life had been a flight from reality, a desperate attempt to construct a more glamorous identity for herself, even if it meant destroying her own family in the process. She had betrayed us not out of malice but out of a desperate, pathetic emptiness inside herself. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for the first time with something that felt real. She asked me if I could ever forgive her. I thought for a long moment. I thought of my father asleep in the next room, oblivious to the drama that had consumed his family. I thought of the 5 years I had lost, the career I had abandoned, the person I might have become. I told her the truth. I told her that forgiveness wasn't a word I could comprehend right now. All I could offer her was an understanding of why she had done it. But understanding, I explained, was a world away from absolution. After Clara left, the house was sold with surprising speed. I found a small, highly rated long-term care facility for my father just outside the city. It was clean, bright, and the staff were kind. The first time I visited him there, I found him sitting by a sunny window listening to music from his youth. He didn't know who I was, but he smiled when I sat with him, a peaceful, contented smile. He was safe. The guilt I had carried for so long, the feeling that I alone was responsible for his well-being, finally began to lift. My mother moved into a small rental apartment on the other side of the state. I hear from her occasionally, a brief, stilted phone call. We don't talk about the past. There's nothing left to say. I now live in Chicago again. I have a small apartment and a job at a design firm, not as glamorous as the one I left, but it's mine. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, the memories surface. The smell of antiseptic, the weight of my father in my arms, the look of utter shock on my mother's face. They are scars, and like all scars, they remind me that I was wounded, but also that I healed. The most valuable lesson I learned was not about the poison of deceit, but about the nature of sacrifice. True sacrifice is a gift given freely and with love. What I had been doing was not sacrifice, it was a transaction. I was trading my life for approval for the title of saint. I learned that you cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm because you will eventually be left with nothing but ashes. And sometimes the most profound act of love is not to give more of yourself, but to reclaim the parts you've given away. It's a quiet reckoning, a slow and painful process, but it's the only path back to a life of your own.